The exercise in total futility, known as elections, is an opportunity for middle class Americans to vote their hopes for some great liar who has promised to uphold what remains of their once great place in society. Inevitably, those hopes are disappointed as the latest grifter who comes to Washington proceeds to do what every one of his predecessors did, namely, tax and spend what remains of the middle class into oblivion. The latest grifter to enter high office has promised to impose multiple double and triple digit taxes on middle income Americans in the form of import tariffs, while also spending hundreds of billions in support of economically destructive wars and natural resource consuming artificial intelligence. Never mind the motive, the end result will be the same as what every president's policy has always been, namely the further destruction of the middle class. That the war on the middle class is deliberate is undoubted. It has continued for too many decades and by too many administrations to be anything less than an established policy pursued by both major parties. And it doesn't take much inquiry to discern the reason why. The middle class must be crushed since it stands in the way of a propertyless multitude that can be easily controlled and dominated by a dictatorial ruling class. It's no secret that every authoritarian regime that has ever existed came about only by the death of the property class of citizens who tend to oppose tyrannical governments. Without a strong middle class, government quickly gives way to brutal authoritarianism since a propertyless multitude has nothing to lose and thus no economic incentive to oppose it. An indication of just how far the middle class has fallen is the virtual destruction of the American dream of home ownership. Most middle-class Americans have been priced out of the housing market in recent years and are now forced into long-term renting through an endless series of federal policies that have put home ownership out of reach for millions. This in turn has created a massive and ever-growing landless class of metropolitan nomads, veritable vagabonds who wander from city to city without ever putting down roots in any one single place. Such a landless group of people are also less inclined to start families and do their part to replenish the native population, thanks again to the high living costs imposed on them by an incessantly meddlesome government. Landlessness eventually fosters political leftism, since Americans whose economic prospects are waning have no vested interest in supporting an office holder whose policies defend property ownership. Instead, such people are inclined to vote into power a demagogue who promises to generously bestow largesse from the public treasury. Now, this, of course, necessitates higher taxes, which in turn serve to further diminish the last remnants of the middle class. Men like Karl Marx and Mao Zedong all understood that communism cannot be established as long as a strong bourgeoisie or middle class stands in its way. And that's why they advocated for the ruin of that class through economically destructive policies, the chief of which is inflation. Indeed, every tyrannical government, whether fascist or communist, has always come to power on a wave of inflation. The rising cost of living such governments usher in is, of course, a deliberate policy affected to erode the purchasing power and the strength of the average working citizen. By raising the cost of everything, their plan is to make everyone entirely dependent on the ruling class for their subsistence. Inflation is in fact one of the most powerful tools at the disposal of the tyrant, since it strips his subjects of all means of resistance to his tyranny and turns them into abject prisoners of his every whim. Once inflation has done its work and has accomplished its objective, and the new dictatorial regime has been established, then the inflation, far from subsiding, becomes more or less permanent. This was true, for instance, of Soviet Russia, which saw a 70-year inflationary period that spanned the entirety of the Soviet Union's history up until its final collapse in 1991. It stands to reason, then, that for inflation to do its work of crushing what remains of America's middle class, rising living costs cannot be permitted to decline, nor can the middle class be given even a moment's respite from inflation's sting. Already we've endured 5+ years of nonstop inflation, with food prices still trending higher, as well as rents and transportation costs further straining the typical American worker, while prices across virtually every major category have reached record highs. And when did the inflation begin? But with the tyranny imposed upon the majority of Americans in 2020. when the nation fell headlong into the bottomless pit of authoritarianism, a system of government that continues to expand in our country even to this day. If history affords any lesson, it is that a nation on its way to complete domination by a totalitarian government will continue under inflation's sway until the middle class is completely destroyed. That in turn allows tyrants to realize the classless society demanded of Marx and Lenin. And that, dear friends, is where we are now headed. As the hour is late and the night is far spent, I'm afraid the time for turning back the tide of this onslaught has passed. Instead of offensive measures, we must concern ourselves with basic self-defense. And that means getting your personal and financial affairs in order. It means also converting at least a portion of your savings into gold and silver in order to provide a defense against the further erosion of your purchasing power from the nonstop inflation. Above all, it means making sure your spiritual house is in order by increasing your devotion to God, reading the Bible, and strengthening your Christian faith to prepare you for the hard times that almost surely lie ahead. This is South Bay. Thanks for listening.